Thank you so much for listening to the Pound This podcast. I am Amanda Valentine, and I am beginning this episode with a disclaimer. And that disclaimer is that I am not a doctor, a therapist, or an expert. And this episode is definitely not a substitute for any of those things. I would highly recommend getting a great doctor, a great therapist, and experts in your life if you feel like that's necessary as well. I am only sharing my personal story and journey and opinions. So that is the disclaimer. Also, a trigger warning in all caps if you need it. Trigger warning! I am discussing very sensitive and triggering topics in this episode. As you can see by the title of this episode, I have been semi-recently diagnosed with complex PTSD, ADHD, PMDD, and perimenopause, which I will get into the definitions of those things. So we're discussing some heavy mental health stuff. So those are some updates for me. So we're going to go into those because all of that stuff is essentially the very root cause of what I have been doing this podcast about for years, which is my physical and mental health, in weight loss and weight gain and body image and all of those things. So I'm getting down to the root issues, and it's pretty intense. So I want to discuss those things. So I am also going to discuss, my own physical health and weight loss, weight gain, etc. So I'm going to get to those things. But first, I want to say, if you are new to this podcast, I wanted to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Amanda Valentine. And I think that if you've listened to this episode for a while, you've probably heard me kind of reiterate this story a million times. But this version of the story that, I've been talking about on this podcast is that I have struggled with my weight and body image my entire life. I've been obese since the age of 6. I've done a ton of fad diets. I did a lot of yo-yo dieting for a long time. And all of that kind of changed in 2012. I had a New Year's resolution to make the best decision possible in every moment. So try to stop doing such restrictive things and being on a diet and just trying to do everything that on the other side of it, does this mentally or physically make me feel well? And just kind of that shift in mindset really, really changed my life. I lost over 100 pounds. It took me about 2.5 years total to lose that weight. And it just set me on a totally different track. I just started walking an insane amount, walking and listening to podcasts. And then I started running, and then I was hiking, and, just then going into the gym. So physical health became really big for me. And then just was a massive meal prepper for a really long time. I have a meal prep cookbook. So very into learning about nutrition, health and wellness in general. And so it changed my life in so many ways for the better that I'm like, oh my gosh, I can talk about this nonstop all the time, which is why I started this podcast. Cause I was like, I'm a yapper about health and wellness. And so, and on top of that, also side note, I worked in radio for over 20 years. So I have a radio background, and, so that plays roles later into talking about some of these diagnoses that I'm going to discuss. So that's kind of the backstory of me of just dealing with health and wellness and weight and body image for a really long time. And I started this podcast. I launched it in January of 2018. And I did this consistently for 6 years. You could see I have well over 800 episodes. And I will say that this podcast changed my life in ways I can't even explain. It makes me want to cry now. I'm probably going to cry in this episode. I should have added that in the disclaimer. But this podcast has opened my eyes to so many things. I didn't realize what I was doing was, binge eating and understanding more about my own health and wellness, and then meeting so many amazing people and experts and people that care about this field. Everything. I started this podcast because I was so passionate about it, about health and wellness and how much it was changing my life, but also because I felt really alone in that process. And I was like, man, it would have been so cool if I would have had this kind of podcast to listen to while I was in the throes of learning my weight loss journey, and just to not feel alone during it. And so that was a big reason why I started this podcast. And it just, man, it's just so many life-changing things for me in so many ways from this podcast. So if you have been listening, I appreciate you so much and I thank you. And I also want to take the opportunity right now to apologize to you because I just disappeared. My last episode aired in November of 2023 and I had full intentions of doing more episodes. I had no intention of just like ghosting out. And so now like I have my favorite podcasts, which shout out to Secondhand Therapy. Awesome podcast. I listen to them every week. And then I'm thinking about like, if I went to go get my Monday episodes and they just gone and they never told me why, I'd be like, are they okay? And I'd be like doing wellness checks on them. And even though I don't know these people, which thank you to everyone that has done wellness checks on me in the past year, I'm doing good. I'm actually like really good. So it's not like I disappeared for bad reasons. So I kind of want to go into that, in November of 2023, I was working at the Cincinnati Nature Center. Oh, also, side note, so I had worked in radio over 20 years. I left that at the end of 2019 to pursue health and wellness full time, including this podcast. So I went through some, legal negotiations to own this podcast myself, which I've owned this since January of 2020. And, since then, in the past 5 years, I have been a full-time entrepreneur. I have been a health coach. I have been an in-person personal trainer. I have been the director of transformation for the YMCA, and I have worked in development at the Cincinnati Nature Center. And now I'm back in radio. So, not only that, I also ended a marriage of a relationship that was 18 years long. So that happened in the past 5 years. Also selling a house, buying a house, moving. So job changes, relationship changes, all of the changes. This is my existential crisis, you guys. But that doesn't mean it's all necessarily like bad either. So in November of last year, I was going to do a whole rebrand of this podcast and lean a little further away from just straight up weight loss and discuss other things. And because I worked at the Nature Center and I'm just a big hiker, outdoorsy chick anyway, I was going to change this, which I still have plans to, Pound This Path. So if you follow me on Instagram, my name had changed to Pound This Path, and I had all of this stuff ready. I worked with Paul Brinker, who's here in Cincinnati, who has designed my website and logos. Sorry, I got a cat loose in here. If you hear him meowing. I have so many animals and I didn't want them all to free range. I had to let one of them free range in the studio. Anyway, so that I was ready to be like, okay, I have not had a break in 6 years from this podcast. I'm going to take a little breather. I'm going to bring it back in January. So I was going to take a break for a couple months and I'm coming back. Fully plan on recording episodes, explaining what I'm doing. And then 1 week after that episode, the last episode that I published came out, I met my current boyfriend. And then 1 week after that, I found myself in a situation where I was being asked, hey, do you want to come back and be on the radio? And so I was like, oh man, I got a lot of stuff to think about. So it went from just like life-changing sort of things that were like very big, very positive distractions. So it was my intention to be like, okay, well, I'm going to, come back to this and do this. And then it was just like knowing what a heavy lift it is to do a consistent podcast. I mean, if you have a podcast, you understand. And if you don't have a podcast, I'm like, everybody can start one and do it consistently and see how long it lasts. It's a lot of work, dude. If you listen to podcasts, please have respect for these people. It's a lot of work. So I'm like, okay, well, if I start this back up again, I got to be consistent. And it was just like, no, I'm just going to do me for a while. So in the past year, I have gone back to radio. You can listen to me from 3 to 7 p.m. on Cat Country 94.1 in Cincinnati, or anywhere in the world in the Cat Country app. And so I'm doing that, which is its own whole thing. And then I've also, just been gaining weight like a champ in the meantime, and not in a negative way, in a way that's like you hear when people are in like happy relationships and they gain weight. that's what your girl's been doing. I've been going out to eat, not counting one damn calorie, and eating ice cream for dessert. So it's definitely challenged my views on my body image and how I feel and my health and wellness. And so that's a whole nother podcast in itself, which I intend on recording. So that's where, and then thinking too of like, I have this health and wellness podcast and I've gained weight, and I haven't gained all my weight back, but I've gained a chunk of it back. But it's also just been really a great challenge to really love my body and really work on my mental health through that. Again, that's a whole nother podcast. So let's get to all this other mental health, really fun stuff that I had to do trigger warnings for, right? Let's get down to the juicies. So with starting this new radio job and when my health insurance kicked in, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go do all the checkups. I'm going to go to my primary care. I'm going to go to the eye doctor. I'm going to go to the dentist. I'm going to go to the gynecologist. I'm just going to like get it all done. We're going to do a full inspection on your girl in her 40s. And so, in the process of all that, I met with my primary care doctor, who is at the Christ Hospital here in Cincinnati, who is amazing. So not only my primary care doctor, she is a psychiatrist as well. So we are kind of, discussing some things. And, before we get into the mental health stuff, I had high blood pressure during that first visit, and that was really concerning to me as a person who had really low blood pressure, especially after losing so much weight and then like eating like insanely bonkers clean healthy for so long. I was like, whoa, listen, I know I have been going a little wild on going out to eat, but I just was like, it was this identity crisis thing for me. I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, I've done all this health and wellness stuff and I have high blood pressure. How can I let this happen? But don't worry, we got that under control. And then also in this discussion was the topic of Ozempic. And that took a lot of thinking through that of like, is that something that I would want to do? What are the risks of that? And that was a lot of like conversation and thinking through that, which I have nothing against that at all. I have no negative feelings towards that, or anybody does it. Everybody's got their own choices and things to do. So it's like, do I want to do that? Like, because it sounds incredibly alluring. It's definitely a siren song to me of like, oh, that sounds like something maybe I want to do. Ultimately made the choice to not do that, at least not in this moment. So I'm not saying that I won't, but I'm saying right now I'm not. And also it's bonkers expensive. My insurance doesn't cover stuff like that. So I'm like, woo, can't afford that either. So anyway, that goes into some of the like, oh my gosh, like, that's where I was just even thinking too, like, oh, I got to fire this podcast back up because I got to talk about all this stuff. But so that's going on. And then also in my conversation with my doctor, there's stuff where I'm like, I know I'm not depressed. I've had depression in the past. I'm like, this isn't depression, but there's just things I can't stay consistent with anymore that I used to. I'm like, I can't stay in a consistent gym routine anymore. I'm not consistently walking anymore. These things brought me so much joy in my life. And I just like can't make myself do them. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know if this is perimenopause in the mix, or what's happening. Because it doesn't feel like depression. What's going on with this? Like, I don't know what's happening. And so my doctor asked me about ADHD. And I was like, well, I'm fairly certain I have that. And if I'm going to let TikTok be my doctor, I 1,000% have ADHD. And so my doctor was like, hey, this is just your general wellness checkup. So let's schedule another appointment where we can do some testing and I can use some like official testing for that, for ADHD. And I'm like, okay, cool. Perfect. So that was a month later. In the meantime, I did see my gynecologist, who is amazing, who I met through this podcast. So she's great. Also, I'm going to put links for all of these resources in the show notes, because I would highly recommend all of these doctors, all these people that I'm talking about in this podcast. And so we discussed of like, yeah, perimenopause, that's happening and that's a thing. And I was like, okay, well, how do I combat this? And she was just like, you need to just like work out and you need to lift heavy, and those sorts of things will help you. And also, side note, I also have Hashimoto's. So I also have an autoimmune disease in the mix. So, then we get to my ADHD testing. So I'm doing all of the testing for that. And yes, bingo, ADHD, which makes a ton of sense for me. And then my doctor was like, let's do some PTSD testing. And I'm like, okay, I wasn't really expecting to that. And so we did some tests for PTSD. And now, again, not a doctor here. I don't remember the name of one of the tests, but she wanted me to share this information with my therapist, which I did, in this way that I'm telling you, which is just like, I don't remember what it's called. But I know that the score of like, once you're kind of like in the danger zone, was a 30, and I was like well into the 40s. And so, I was like, okay, what do I do with this? And she's just, describing to me what's going on with that and how like that plays into ADHD. And her recommendation was that UC Health, which is here in Cincinnati, has a stress center, and they have a PTSD program that is 12 to 15 weeks. And she was like, I really highly recommend that you go through that and work through some of these things. The way she described it to me is basically like taking all of my baggage and carrying them around in really heavy suitcases, and doing some of this therapy will like lighten the load so I can go through life with lighter suitcases. And so she said to give them a call, and I did. And I did a bunch of like questionnaires and stuff like that, and a screener phone call to see if I qualified. And I did. And then my insurance didn't cover it, but she told me, she's like, but we have a grant for that, so you don't need to pay for this. And it's been so amazing, as a person who has worked at multiple nonprofits and have done so much charity work and helping people raise money before, to be like, oh my gosh, I'm on the receiving end of that now. Some donor donated money so people like me could go through this therapy. I wouldn't pay for it otherwise. I couldn't afford it. So if you have an organization that you support, donate money if you can. And so like that's a whole nother thing where I was just like, oh my gosh, this just hits home for me too, of like, wow, being on the receiving end of a very generous donation, for something that's life-changing, is amazing. So I've been in this program, at UC Health for 4 or 5 weeks now. So I don't want to go into details or anything like that, but I will say, here's the trigger warning part. Trigger warning that, starting at a very young age, I have dealt with sexual, emotional, and physical abuse. And the reason why it's complex PTSD is because it's ongoing abuse. And so to kind of give you the definition that I pulled up for CPTSD versus PTSD, I am just reading from this website. So it says the main difference between the two disorders is the frequency of the trauma which caused it. While PTSD is usually caused by a single traumatic event, CPTSD is caused by multiple long-lasting, repeated, or continuous traumas, commonly referred to as complex trauma. So that said, studies have found that some people who've experienced multiple traumas develop PTSD, and others who've experienced one trauma develop CPTSD. So the number of intensity or duration of traumas you experience don't necessarily make the diagnosis of PTSD versus whatever. That goes into the weeds. So if you look up CPTSD, yeah, it's just, it's chronic stress. It's chronic, prolonged, traumas that go on for a long time. And, like this says, it's like chronic sexual, psychological, and physical abuse or neglect. And so, so there's that's definitely going on. And then, yeah, so that, I mean, that's the root causes of so much of this stuff. So, and there's a lot of these things that I didn't really start unpacking, until the beginning of 2012 and the health journey where I recently, I just discussed minutes ago of, starting this health journey that led me to losing over 100 pounds and keeping that off for over a decade. And so, and I wanted to discuss that a lot on this podcast of how that, those sorts of traumas led to my binge eating, but it was just it was not the right place. It was not the right time. But now feels like the right time to start those sorts of discussions because again, if anybody's dealing with that, you're not alone. The people are dealing with these things and trying to figure them out. And again, this is my story and my journey, how I'm trying to figure those things out. So there's a lot of stuff that I definitely buried and repressed and didn't dig out or didn't start digging out until then, which led to a lot of breakthroughs of being healthier. And then definitely starting in 2020 is when I started going to therapy and seeing an actual therapist and really kind of digging into deeper topics and really unpacking a lot of these things. And so the core of these things lead to everything that I've ever discussed on this podcast is that dealing with these traumas that I have dealt with that I didn't know how to handle them. I don't know how to regulate my emotions. And I had, when some of these things were happening, I had asked for help and that went ignored. So I didn't know what else to do. So I turned to two main things to help me deal with, navigating life. And that was one, eating. So I knew that food could, I could disassociate and numb out with food and, you got to eat, right? So that's definitely where a lot of like binge eating, comfort eating, emotional eating. That's going to be lifelong for me. I just learned that at an extremely early age that food's always there and food helps me numb out. So, which leads to, body image and obesity and all these other things. So there was that. And then the second way that I learned to deal with these things was by listening to the radio. So starting at a very young age, I would just always in a rocking chair. Which makes sense now through all this, therapy that I've been in of, doing like the rocking sort of sensations in a rocking chair, listening to radio. So it started off with just listening to a stereo and headphones. And I used to be obsessed with the oldie station. I do love me some Tommy James and the Shondells. And so, and then it just turned into Walkman. And then I was always listening to my Walkman and, like just obsessively listening to the radio. And then I found a morning show I really loved. And then I felt really connected to them and they felt like they were my friends. And that's the way like I disassociated. That's the way I tuned out and left the world that I was living in. And this was my immersive world that I joined. And so that's when, I wanted to go into radio. I didn't even want to be on the air or anything. I was just like, I just wanted to be a part of it. Like, it just felt like a connection. Like they were my friends, even though I didn't know them. And that's how I feel about podcasts. And that's like the podcasts I listen to. I'm like, I don't know these people. And I'm like, I feel like they're my best friends. And then I literally met my favorite podcast once and they probably thought I was a psycho and wanted to get a restraining order because I fangirled so hard. So yeah, so that explains, the radio and the podcast career, that angle of it. And then, just the food issues and then just dealing with the narratives that I learned of like being fat's gross and being fat is unlovable. And so I'm like eating food to try to like deal, and then being told that I'm like this awful person because the way my body looks because of it. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of, a lot of not fun stuff rolling around up in this dome that's been happening for a long time. And I will say that, just even in my most fittest, my lowest weight, visible abs on a daily basis, I still felt fat. I felt like a trash bag full of nacho cheese, still just like so in my head. I've lived every shade of this journey, and I'm still learning more. Like the journey's never over, but I've gone from, binge eating to binge exercising and being so meticulous with macros and every single calorie to like not caring, or, being more balanced. I've just like, it's just this constant flow. And then when things that work for you and then you try doing them again and they don't work, which is what I've kind of been doing the past couple of years, you feel like so like broken and nuts. And my body's not the same. My body's not going to react those same ways. And like, it's a whole lot of things going on, which sounds like bad and depressing. And it's not. There's definitely days that are. I definitely have way more good days than bad days, but there are bad days. And so that's where it's like getting these like diagnoses to be like, oh my gosh, like even my doctor asked me like, how does it make you feel to have a diagnosis of PTSD? And I was like, honestly, it just feels relieving. Like, it just feels like this makes sense. And finding out I have ADHD, I'm like, this makes so much sense. It's helping me understand myself in just ways I didn't before. And then also in the process of all of this, with how insanely awful I feel like the week leading up to my period, and discussing these things with my doctor, that led to a PMDD diagnosis. I've got all these letters, you guys. I'm going to have the whole alphabet behind my name. But PMDD, which if you don't know what that is, oh wait, I pulled up the wrong definition that I got, is premenstrual dysphoric. I'm not a doctor, dudes. Disorder, which is essentially the week before your period is a living hell. And for me, mentally. So it's not like my cramps or anything so bad. It is into a pit of despair and depression and irritability and tension. And I'm like, it's like I float outside of my body and I'm like, this isn't you. Like, it is like a monster takes over. And I'm like, I just go in this deep, dark hole. And I'm like, just come out of it, girl. Like, come on, you're good. And like, you just can't. And I just feel nuts on top of everything else. You know what I'm saying? And so I definitely did some of my own research. Again, not a doctor. That can be attached to a lot of women that also have ADHD. And it also felt so good for me to be like, okay, I'm not alone. It's not like, oh man, she's just, that girl's nuts when she's on her period. Of like, no, seriously, this is intense. This is bad. And I have friends that deal with this also. And like, it's just like, it's bonkers. So if you feel that, talk to your doctor about it. And if your doctor is dismissive about you or about this with you, go to a different doctor. That is my recommendation. Again, not an expert therapist or doctor. But it's like, to also understand of like these things that if you just let me roll around in my own head, I will tell you all these awful things about myself. And I will be like, this is just you. You are broken. You can't figure it out. Get it together. So just my own bully to level freaking 100. And so to know that I have like, okay, like, no, I've done testing. I'm having these conversations. I have these things. I have a diagnosis, just feels like, I understand now. It's not just me. And it's not that I can't handle it. It's that I got stuff and I'm working through it. And I feel like I mean, I've been, nose deep in self-help books and learning about this stuff for years and years. And then this podcast on top of it, like so into like wanting to understand and learn. And there's just so much more. And I feel like in this arena, I'm just scratching the surface for myself. And, a friend asked me a few weeks ago, because I was just, explaining my sessions that I'm doing at UC, which I'll talk to you here about in a second. And she was like, do you feel really relieved whenever you leave those sessions? And I'm like, I don't feel relief in this moment. Again, I haven't completed this program, that I feel like I've been living my life in a room with the lights turned off. And now I've turned the lights on. And I'm like, oh, I see why I keep tripping over there. There's a bunch of crap laying on the floor. Now I can see it. And now I can work on cleaning up that pile of crap that I keep tripping over. And that's what it feels like. But it's also a lot of work. It's really hard. It's definitely brings a bunch of stuff up to the surface and just really makes me reevaluate the way that I think. So this program that I'm in at UC at the Stress Center is it's all science-based. So it's not talk therapy. It's a series of homework. I'm doing homework every single day. So it's intensive. And it's basically like, this is how my brain's working. This is where I think of things. And then this is how can I reroute that and create a new path in my brain. I'm so used to working this path that it is just a well-worn, no question about it, I'm taking this path every time. And I'm like, no, I got to get the machete out and I'm creating a new path. And I have to take these other paths because I know where this other path is going to take me. It's going to take me to the place that I always do, which leads to me beating myself up and being mean to myself and seeing the world through these, toxic lenses. And so, I will say, like, it's just what was really crazy. And I'd say the hardest session that I've done so far was, I had to do like a journaling homework. And so it was asking me all of these questions that I was filling out and answering. And that took me a while. I did that at home and journaled that all out. So I was with my therapist and reading these answers, and she's kind of challenging me and asked me questions through it. And then she's like, okay, while you're doing that, what I heard was stuck points of like just these things, that loops of things that I say in my head to myself and the beliefs that I have about myself. She's like, this is, these are where I believe your stuck points are and what the things we need to work on. She printed this thing out and it's 2 pages long, and she hands it to me and she's like, okay, can you read over those and tell me if you feel like that's accurate? And see, I'm going to cry now. I'm reading this list and I'm like, I just couldn't even help it. Just tears streaming out of my face. Like my pants are getting wet from like just uncontrollable, just like crying, reading these things that I think about myself. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is horrific. Just basically like, I'm unlovable if my, like it wasn't this, I don't have it in front of me because I didn't want to read this on here. Just like so much stuff about like my body and who I am and my worth. And it was just like so painfully eye-opening. And I'm like, that's those are the things that I think about myself. And so then, the next level of homework, which it has been the past couple of weeks, is like, we're going to take these things and we're going to really look at them, and are they true, and what's true, like, what's fact and what's fiction, and what do these things make you feel? I mean, it's hard, dude, when you have to take these things and you have to like unpack and unwind this like, awful thought you have in your head. Like something as simple as like looking in the mirror and be like, oh, like I'm so fat, and just hating on yourself. And then like really unpacking of like, where is that coming from? How does this make me feel? Is that true? Is this just your perspective? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And is that true according to who? And like all of this stuff. And it's just like, oh man. But again, in the best way possible. So, I don't want it to get twisted anywhere that I'm discussing these things is in any sort of way that these are negatives or I'm in a bad place. I want to discuss this because, again, I know that I'm not alone in these things, and I'm hoping these conversations help other people, because this is stuff that we don't just walk around talking about, except for me, because I'm a yapper. Just ask my coworkers. I was like, hey, you want to hear about my PTSD therapy? And so, that these things can be worked through, and they're really hard, and there's resources, and you're not alone in these things. And I'm not alone in these things, which makes me feel so much better. And I think that's where, I think the positives of things like TikTok, even though I can get in my own, like, doom scrolling, I'm numbing out. Like, I think scrolling feels like the new binge eating for me. I don't really binge eat anymore, which is amazing and awesome. But I do definitely like want to tap out from the world and will just stupid scroll for like 2-3 hours. And I'm like, I really got nothing done, and I didn't really learn too much. But now that, my algorithm is tuned into all this stuff, and I'm seeing other women sharing their stories of PMDD or their ADHD or their, CPTSD or PTSD or their perimenopause, it just makes me feel like, oh my gosh, oh, you're saying it out loud. And like, it just makes me feel so much better. So knowing that I have this podcast, and that I could have that level of having these discussions, I want to have them. And I love talking about self-growth. As I told my doctor whenever we first started working together, that I'm like, I am a self-growth slut. Which she found funny. So I'm like, I love this stuff. And I mean, it's hard, but man, I can't even list the ways that I've gotten so much better. Like, I feel like if you think that you know me, no, you don't. Like, not only have I changed so much in so many years of my life, just the past year alone, just the past 6 months alone, I am such a completely different person in so many different ways. I just feel like I'm a calmer person, a more peaceful person. I don't know. I feel like more balanced, and not to say I don't have bad days and like I go into bad places. I for sure have that, especially like pulling all this stuff up and really like talking about like hard traumas that I've been through, and like kind of like having to like relive them to like unpack them. Like, that's not fun. That definitely doesn't make the rest of my day great. But the next day is so much better. So, yeah, it's just been like, I feel like I just like keep evolving and growing in so many, in so many different ways. And that just changes like your whole life around you. And that can be really, really scary. And parts of it are really scary. So because your relationships change and the people in your life change and your situations change as you're dealing with this sort of stuff. But I feel like, just dealing so much with my weight and my body image for so long, and being like, at its core, it comes down to me and how I regulate my emotions. How do I talk to myself? How do I feel about myself? And I mean, outside of like, man, we could go on forever too, of just like how mouthfeel of food and how it's designed to make you binge eat it. Like, you got all of those obstacles on top of it. Right. And I have said this, and it's a joke, but it is 100% fact. And it is still fact. I have never owned a chip clip. If I'm open a bag of chips, I'm eating that entire thing. I'm still doing that. I wouldn't classify that as a binge for me, because I feel like a binge for me, when being binge eating before, would be like almost like fever pitch. Like, I just got to numb out. Like, it is just like, it doesn't even matter what it is. I eat crackers off the floor just to eat something. Eating a whole bag of chips is because it's like damn delicious, and it's designed to eat it that way. It's designed to keep you eating more. So you can go into the whole discussion about like how hard it is to navigate food and fitness. And like, obviously I've had a bunch of those discussions on this podcast, and I hope to continue to. So, I mean, there's that whole element, But that's just thrown on top of all of this stuff for me in my journey, and what I'm kind of like figuring out and navigating, because it all plays together. And just kind of like I was mentioning earlier of, having like gained weight, and really trying to like love my body through that, of like, is it so bad? I mean, I want to be healthy, and trust me, I do want to lose weight. I want to feel better in my skin and more comfortable. So I don't want to say like I don't want to. But it's different reasons, and it's different. It's just my brain's in a different place around it, if that makes sense. It doesn't feel like I want to lose weight because I'm like, oh, you're so fat and gross, you have to do this. And I really want to be like really, really work through that. So I almost feel like, I feel like I'm a person that believes everything happens for a reason. So I feel like I'm in the space that I am now to really challenge a lot of these old thoughts and feelings that I have towards my body, specifically around my weight and my worth. And and just like what I'm willing to do and what I won't, and what season of life that I'm in right now. I've been in seasons where macro counting has been absolutely amazing for me, and I have loved the process. Loved it. Honestly, loved it. I am not there right now. No. If I had to count macros every day right now, I would be very, very angry about it, and I would probably do it for 3 or 4 days, and then I would probably go off the rails a little bit. Not like in a binge, but I'd be like, whatever. Like, I am making the least unhealthy choice right now because I didn't feel like doing that, and I made myself do something I don't feel like doing. So I feel like right now it's this interesting balance of, you don't want to be like too relaxed and be like just like you don't want to abuse yourself with food, which I definitely have. But like, how do you find this like balance of like, you're feeling good about all of your choices, even if those choices aren't quote unquote as good as they used to be, if that makes sense. So I'm in the middle of navigating all of this stuff. So that's where I'm like, I hope this is helpful to hear these things. And I hope in the future to have more discussions around these sorts of things, because I think, mental health is just such a huge topic, and impacts us in every single way, no matter what you've been through in life. We've all faced our own traumas and demons, and I don't feel like people should get into a comparison game of like, oh, well, what you've been through is worse than what I have to do. No, it's what you've been through is, if it's impacted you in a way, it's impacted you. You know what I'm saying? Like, trauma is trauma. And people are going to deal with things in all sorts of different ways. And just going through COVID and us living through all of that as a planet, that's its own level of trauma, and our own mental health, and how we're like dealing with that. Like, I still feel like, what a time warp weird year. What year is this? Like, I still think like 2017 was like 3 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, there's just like so many layers of stuff. And I feel like if you don't start working through some of these things, they're going to show up in these negative ways. Like for me, binge eating, disassociating, being so awful to myself. So I think the thing that's been repeated to me the most by the series of doctors I've been to has just been, you just got to be kind to yourself. I'm just so mean to myself. And learning more about complex PTSD, that's definitely one of the big symptoms of it. So definitely trying to rewire some of those things, which I think definitely plays into, how I eat, how I exercise, and my relationship with those things. So as much as like, even I have been in good places where I'm not doing this because I need to be smaller or I'm beating myself up, it'll inevitably always find its way back there somehow. So, it's just like unpacking all of that stuff for me. So I really thought this episode was going to go on for like 3 hours. I'm like, man, I could talk about this like forever. But I guess in this moment, that's just what I have to say right now. And I thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast and supporting me. And I want to bring up to the people that have reached out to me and did wellness checks on me. I appreciate that. I mean, so much. And the people that have reached out to me Instagram, because I used to do Meal Prep Sunday every Sunday and show my whole meal prep process and had a lot of fun on social media. And I've like essentially been a ghost on social media. And that's also on purpose and not because anything's bad. It's like really been like, I just like living my life, not on my phone. I've had so many amazing, awesome moments in the past couple of years, and I didn't even think to pull out my phone. And I feel like for me, that's growth. I like being in the moment. I like being around the people that I love and not look at my phone at all and not think about how can I post this or how to, what can I do? And then constantly checking my phone. Is this getting engagement and like all that stuff? I'm just not in the season of that. No, nothing against anybody else that is. It's just not where I'm vibing with right now, but I also know I'm going to have to do that to promote this podcast. So, we're going to figure all of that stuff out, but yeah, I really appreciate that. And again, I apologize for, not providing content anymore that I know was really helpful and people really enjoyed. And I love making people laugh and I love entertaining people and I love helping people so much. And all of those things, this podcast, social media, all of that stuff, events that I've done, everything give me so much joy. And it's just been, it also is just nice to take a break and have some calm and really learn who this version of me is. Because as I said earlier, I've evolved a lot. I've changed a lot. If you think you know me, no, you don't. I'm just really learning who Amanda Valentine is in this moment, 42 years old. What do I love now? What are the things that bring me joy now? How do I want to spend my time? What's important to me? And just, going through the evaluation of all those things and really focusing on that and not doing things that don't feel good, of doing things when they feel good and not doing them when they don't feel good. Whether or not there's this pressure of like, oh, you got to like keep up engagement or you got to keep up your podcast numbers and you got to stay consistent and then just get wrapped up in that. Then I'm like, I'm not doing that for the right reasons. That's not why I started doing these things. And if that's what it's become, like, then I'm not meant to do that right now. So, I want to do things because it comes from a very genuine, authentic place. And if I'm not doing it from that place, then I don't want to do it. Towards the end of me doing my meal prep on Instagram every Sunday, I was having like legit meltdowns, like legit crying on the floor, freaking out because I did not feel like being a performer. I didn't feel like being fun and silly. I just wanted to listen to a podcast and cook my food, but I felt like I needed to. And I'm like, I can't do that. Like, this is the thing that was created for me. And I loved this for me. This helped my mental and physical health. And now I'm not doing it for those reasons anymore. So it's like, I still do meal prep. So I'm like, I don't meal prep as like as intense as I used to. Like, I'm not meal prepping every meal, but I still meal prep every week. So I enjoy meal prepping. And I typically now I meal prep on Monday nights. And because my favorite podcast, they release their podcast on Mondays. And so Monday night I meal prep and listen to their podcast, which again is secondhand therapy. If you need more therapy to listen to. So that's my little routine. And I feel like if I was trying to Instagram it or whatever, like that takes away from this thing that's giving me a lot of joy. And if it feels good to do those things on social media, then I'll do them. And if they don't, I won't. And so And I'm also really learning those boundaries being on the radio. So, I mean, after working in radio, moving all over the country, doing radio for 20 years, and then quitting and thinking I was never going to go back to randomly being back and doing a show by myself. It's a lot of things that I learned too, of like, there's got to be a lot of boundaries around my own mental health with this, and how much do I share, and what's just for me. And so it's been a lot. It's been really, really good. And, but it's so much growth and learning, which has its own really tough moments. So I feel like I'm repeating myself and rambling right now, but if you have any questions at all, that either for me personally or you want me to discuss on this podcast, you can always email me at amanda@amandavalentinebites.com. Or on Instagram, you can follow me at #PoundThisPath. And even though I'm not posting on there a ton, I'm still a lurker. So I'll still go on there, mostly to read like all my positive affirmation accounts that I follow. And so you could always write me a message there. I hope this episode was helpful. This was so hard. I guess let me just keep rambling. This was so hard for me to record. Like, I've done so many podcasts and been on the radio so long, and this episode, I've just been thinking about it forever. I've been thinking about how am I going to, come back with this episode, and also coming back with a podcast episode means I need to be consistent with it, right? At least as consistent as I can be. So I guess no promises after I just went on and ranted of like, if it doesn't feel good, I'm not going to do it. Man, I've just rehearsed this episode so many times in my head. I've been in the shower thinking about what I want to say. That's why I'm like, I wrote my little notes of like, okay, this is how I want to open things up. How am I going to discuss this? I'm like, these are some really heavy things. How do I go into this and have people understand without going into details? And it's just, it's one of those things you just gotta jump. I'm definitely a risk taker, and, so you just got to go sometimes, and it's not going to be perfect. I tend to see things in a black and white world and under a lens of perfectionism, which plays into all of the things we just discussed in this podcast. So I got to let that stuff go and just let things be what they're going to be. And so I am throwing this out there in the hopes that the people that need to hear it, and it's helpful. And I also want to say that you matter, and it's important that you're here. And I say this to myself, and I think life is incredibly beautiful and wonderful and worth living, even in the darkest moments. So if you're going through some rough times and you're having some, thinking about some really rough things that might fall into any category, I want you to know that you can get through it, and you can be supported and loved, and you can just life can be really, really great. And again, for everybody who's listening to this, thank you so much for making my life so much better. Again, with this podcast, it's just such a love story to this podcast, and everybody that's ever listened and supported this podcast has made my life so much better, and has really helped me in really dark moments of my life, of seeing people's really positive comments. It's just life changing. So thank you to you. And I'm just going to start crying again. So I'm just going to end this. Love you guys.